Just want to say briefly, the Environmental Law Institute is a nonpartisan think and do tank. We are a publishing, education, and research organization. Been around since 1969, and work. Our slogan is "Making law work for people, places, and the planet." So this is very much a part of ELI's mission of making sure that issues are illuminated in the public space. And I'm very pleased to host this event, and I'm going to turn it over immediately to Kent so that we can get started. Okay. Thanks. Thank you. Thanks for hosting us. So my slide's going to come up. Good afternoon. We have some people coming in yet. My name is Kent Shesky. I serve as the Executive Vice President for the Council for Agricultural Science and Technology, CAST. We're actually located in Ames, Iowa. CAST's organization has been around since 1973. And just to kind of open up before we get into our presentation on our paper, I just want to take a couple minutes just to give you kind of an overview of CAST, what we do, how we do it, and kind of why we do it. CAST's mission is that we assemble, interpret, and communicate unbiased, credible, science-based information, primarily around food and agriculture topics. We work on issues that are regional, national, and often international in terms of the issues that we take on. Our target audience is legislators, regulators, policymakers, media, and the public is who we're trying to reach. You noted the picture of Dr. Norman Borlaug, one of the people that's an important part of CAST's legacy. He was one of the voices that kind of helped establish Stand Up CAST, one of the contributors to one of the first CAST papers that papers that CAST did, and actually one of the last writings that he did was on a CAST paper shortly before his death. But an important part of our legacy, and somebody whose thoughts, ideas we try to emulate in the work we do. What does CAST do? CAST is primarily known for its dissemination of science-based information. We do this through printed materials. We do it through online videos, online sources, and also we do it through videos now that you can find on YouTube, SchoolTube, and other sources. How do we do it? We do it with the help of many volunteer contributors. We have board members across 3 different boards, about 50 people who volunteer their time, expertise, and knowledge to help move us forward. Those represent scientific societies, companies, nonprofits, and universities. We have about more than 70 actually scientists engaged right now on various task forces helping write issue papers or commentary papers around a whole variety of topics. And if you're interested in what are the future topics we're doing, there's a publication actually over on that back credenza that if you want to pick it up, shows you some of the publications that we'll be coming out with in the next several months. Over the last several years, we've tracked where do these scientists come from. And you can see that of the more than 300 volunteers since 2007, 65% of those are from academia, 15% from the government, 15% from private companies, and 5% from nonprofits. We think that's a good mix, a good diversity of viewpoints that we bring to the discussion. Primary objectives, I guess, in 2 areas: publishing and distributing, publishing task force commentaries, issue papers that are written and peer-reviewed from scientists from many disciplines. And I think one of the other things that we want to make sure is that we're really taking a multidisciplinary approach to a lot of these topics and having as well-rounded views on the science and what its implications are. Distributing CAST publications widely to non-scientists. I have to say our role is to help explain science to a non-scientific audience. We give this charge when we assemble our writing teams, that they understand the audience and kind of what the charge is about, with the goal of helping enhancing their education and understanding of some of these topics. One of the things that CAST is well known for is our Friday Notes e-publication that comes out every Friday, a newsletter. We publish this 48 times a year. There's a couple of months that we let staff take a break from that. But basically, it's a synopsis of a lot of the science kind of mixed in with policy and news that's going on. And really what we're really trying to do is highlight the underlying science behind a lot of these issues, whether they be policy issues or issues that are driving the private sector discussion. We have more than 60 current agriculture news items selected from over 100 sources that we kind of scan and pull this together. We also include a section on what's happening outside the United States in terms of the international dimensions. And it also then looks at kind of what's happening in the legislative and regulatory side. And again, you know, we're kind of nonpartisan. We're not taking issues on these. We're really just helping to elevate the science discussion behind a lot of the issues that you hear being discussed. Also, a growing presence around social media. How do we use social media to more effectively communicate science around some of these important issues, and something that is of major interest and focus to us. This is information on our website, www.castscience.org. If you're not familiar with the site, we encourage you to come and visit it. Pretty much all of the stuff that we have written over the past is free for you to download and see. A couple things to note, and you have examples in front of you. When we do a paper, be a commentary issue paper, you see the copy of the actual paper. But then the other part of it is we develop a quickcast document that really helps kind of provide a one-page synopsis of it. When that's delivered electronically, what you see there in blue is actually links to the underlying science that helps kind of provide the additional background. If you note in the map on the slide, our materials from CAST are being accessed by an audience outside the United States, and we're very proud of that. We think that, you know, the value of what CAST produces goes far beyond the borders of the United States, and how can we share that more globally. And we're very pleased to see that in our tracking system, we're able to find out where people are accessing CAST information, and you see it is pretty widely dispersed around the globe. A little bit about the quickcast. It's a one-page document that provides kind of a summary of overview of each of our issue papers or CAST commentaries, live links to kind of the science behind the issues or the documentation behind that. Those are free on our website and printable for distribution or handout, and you see an example of that in front of you as well. To really learn more about CAST as an organization, what we do, why we do it, how we do it, I would encourage again for you to visit our website. We're a relatively small organization. I have an outstanding group of folks that I work with in the CAST office in Ames, as well as a great group of professionals who serve on our board and really contribute a lot in terms of helping move our organization forward. So again, on behalf of the staff, the board, all of the volunteers that make our organization, I want to thank all of you who are here today, plus the many of you who are connecting today via the live webinar. Thank you for being a part of this program. Today's program, and you can see a slide of kind of the agenda we're going to follow today, life cycle approach to low invasion potential bioenergy production. Very pleased to have with us today Dr. Jacob Barney from the Virginia Tech University. He served as the task force chair for this. He'll talk a little bit about who else served on his team, but one of the other important people that was part of that writing project was Reed Porter, senior attorney and director of the Invasive Species Program here at the Environmental Law Institute. And actually, thank you, Reed, for your help in helping us secure this venue to do this rollout as well. And then I'll introduce a little later. We've got some other folks with us today who are going to provide their thoughts, perspectives on the paper. And then what we're going to do at the end of the program is bring the two folks from the presenting the paper along with the other three presenters up, and we're going to have some Q&A. So be thinking about questions and answers. For those of you who are on webinar, if you'd like to submit questions via the text box, we will make sure that we consider those questions as well as when we get into the Q&A version. So again, thank you very much. And at this point, I'm going to turn the program over to Dr. Barney.
All right. Thanks, Ken. I want to thank CAST again for organizing this paper. Thank you, ELI, for hosting us here. And what we're going to do today is just provide an overview of the CAST commentary paper. It's going to be sort of a brief summary of what we found. And I couldn't have done this without the team. I organized the team, but most of the writing was done by Adam Davis, Reed Porter, and Dan Simberloff. And we had a great group of reviewers who provided some great perspective both domestically and internationally. And so again, the focus of our commentary was how do we facilitate bioenergy production while minimizing the invasion risk of those crops in particular. So just to set the stage, many of you know this already, we've been using bioenergy since the dawn of humans, since we created fire and burning wood. However, the topic today is mostly was facilitated about a decade ago during the Bush administration with the Renewable Fuel Standard and some changes to the Farm Bill that were designed to integrate renewable fuels, particularly into our gasoline supply as a fuel additive. You've probably all seen on the fuel pumps the 10% ethanol in your fuel. Well, all of that currently comes from corn. So the idea here is that we would shift away from using corn that could be used to feed animals and move in towards more dedicated crops that are grown specifically for the purpose of conversion to energy. So these have a variety of benefits, some of which include the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. That's becoming an increasingly relevant topic, especially today. It would enhance our domestic energy production. Obviously, the less that we can rely on foreign sources of energy, that increases national security. And finally, having a long-term energy solution. As we all know, there's finite resources of fossil fuels, so looking for some other sources of energy is going to become increasingly necessary. So how do we meet this, the goals that were set forth in a couple of these statutes? And one was so the government put together an organization to figure out how much biomass will we actually need. And well, they came up with a study that was since revised that said we need approximately 1 billion tons of biomass annually. So this is an enormous amount of biomass to be harvested across a range of sectors. Dedicated energy crops is one component of that. It also includes forestry, etc. And the land that we would need to achieve this goal varies, but you can think of it as many tens of millions of acres. So this is new land. This is not to displace corn and soybean and our tomatoes. This would be new land under production. And so, unlike our traditional crops, which, as you know, we plant them once a year, at the end of the season we harvest them and we gather their fruit or grain, and then we repeat that cycle. Unlike those crops, bioenergy crops are designed to be relatively low input. So the economics of bioenergy are such that we need to have very few resources input to make them to grow productively annually. So the first place to start is that the vast majority of them are perennial, meaning that we plant them once and they can last and be productive for ideally many decades, unlike the annual cycle. We want them to produce a lot of biomass because, again, unlike traditional crops where we harvest the grain or the fruit, in this case we're looking at the leaves and stems. We need them to be very big. As I said, we're going to be talking about tens of millions of new acres of land under production. So all of the good productive land in the United States is basically taken. So now we're talking about additional land. And this is often called marginal lands because they're either on slopes or have poor fertility or have high saline contents. So again, ideally these crops would be very tolerant of those poor growing conditions. And lastly, we want them to be very competitive and have few pests because unlike our traditional crops where we spray them all the time to manage weeds, manage pathogens, and manage insects, ideally those all would not be the case for bioenergy because we don't want to have those added economic inputs to achieve biomass production. So when you look at this list, it's very different than our corn and soybeans. And from an agronomic perspective, this is sort of the goal. But as someone that's an invasion biologist, you look at that list and it looks like you're designing the ideal invasive plant. So this is part of the concern. Now that's not to say that if you had all these traits, you'd necessarily be invasive or that all invasive plants have these traits. But you can see the contrast to our traditional agronomic crops. And we've seen this movie before. This is sort of a classic example that anybody from the southeastern United States and increasingly in the mid-Atlantic and Northeast knows Kudzu, which was planted by the tens of millions, subsidized by the federal government to reduce soil erosion. And it did its job a little too well and has since escaped and become the vine that ate the South. So what we're trying to do in this scenario is prevent the Kudzu effect, right? We don't want Kudzu 2.0. That's sort of the goal here. And so if you look at the range of invasive plants, the majority of them we intentionally introduced. Now we did not introduce them to become invasive, obviously, but a consequence of that introduction is that many of them escaped and became invasive. Then some of the introduction pathways were for horticulture, so ornamental plants and garden plants, forages to feed our animals, and forestry production. So that's the point here is that often we have noble intentions to introduce something, and there's unintentional consequences from that introduction. And one of the ways to demonstrate how relevant invasive species are is to talk about how much they cost. What's the sort of economic consequence of invasive species? Now, this estimate comes from all invasive species, not just invasive plants. And you've probably all seen the statistic that it's over $100 billion a year in economic damage, if you will, to the United States alone. And when you scale that to the world, it's stuff got moved, but it's $1.4 trillion globally. So this is not a minor piece here. So this is just from our existing invaders. So ideally here we're trying to prevent any additions to those statistics. And it's not just economic consequences. This is one of the things that I spent my research program on is what are the ecological consequences of invasive species. And they're numerous. And here's just a small laundry list of some of the consequences from invasive plants. They reduce native biodiversity. They cause intense fire cycles in some cases. They can choke out waterways. So there's a list of these sort of negative ecological consequences that we're trying to prevent. So they have economic consequences as well as ecological. And this is a quote from one of our co-authors that I'm a big fan of because I think it nicely summarizes the situation with regard to invasives. And that's almost as a rule, once we have an invasive species, it's pretty much here to stay. Our eradication success stories are unfortunately very small. So this sort of plays to the adage, the cliche that prevention is the best policy. So if we can prevent the next invader, that's where we're going to be most successful, as opposed to trying to put it back in the box after the fact. So this is the approach we took as a team so how do we mitigate the invasion potential of bioenergy crops? Well, the first thing to note is that there's no single solution. So what our team developed was what we're calling a life cycle approach. And if you will, you notice on the top here that you see the sort of stages of the biofuel supply chain, from choosing a species to producing it in the farmer's field to harvesting it and converting it into energy. And we're going to highlight sort of on each one of these along the pathway. And we've adopted what's called this sort of nested sieve approach. So you can sort of think of it as a decision tree. So as you go through each step along the process, if you identify something that's high risk, maybe you kick it out. If it has an acceptable level of risk, it goes down to the next stage in the process. So we sort of adopted this approach to our life cycle assessment. Okay, so just to begin with, I'm just going to highlight each one of these. The first place you start is with cultivar selection. And I'm just highlighting one sort of very easy example on sort of cultivar selection. Giant miscanthus is the sort of daughter hybrid species of Miscanthus sinensis and Saccharophloris. Both of those species are in the 6 to 8 foot range. This plant's in the sort of 15 to 20 foot range. It's a much larger version. And there's basically two forms. On the left, I'm showing you what's called the Illinois clone. This is a sterile hybrid, so it does not make fertile seed. The only way it can reproduce is by underground rhizomes or above ground stem fragments. You contrast that with the same plant effectively on the right, which makes fertile wind dispersed seed. Now the reason that this was developed was because it's very expensive to plant the rhizomes, so they're looking for a more economical way to establish the crop. So they generated fertile seed, but that has the consequence of having a higher probability of escaping the fields. So you can see the dichotomy here, and it's a very simple trait. And one of the other things I want to point out on the bottom there is that all species have some probability of being invasive. And I like to think about this as invaders are the right plant in the right place at the right time. All those three things have to be sort of in line to result in an invasion. And invasive plants are not invasive everywhere. It's very context specific. So one of the tools that is used, and I know we've got the weed risk assessment guru in the house today to talk about this in more detail in a minute, but one of the tools that's used is the weed risk assessment. This is a policy tool that was developed in Australia about 20 years ago because they had the problem of having so many invasive species. They needed a tool to screen which plants they would allow import into the country. And so this has been highly effective and has been adopted worldwide as a tool to identify risk. And effectively what it is you answer a series of questions and it results in a recommendation at the end of either being high risk or low risk. And the Australian version differs in its outcome from the U.S. version that I'm sure will be covered later. And if you just screen, there's lots of people that have done these sorts of assessments. And what you see is that a lot of the bioenergy crops tend to have a fairly high risk. Now, one of the sort of primary predictors of invasiveness is if it's invasive elsewhere. And a lot of these species are, in fact, invasive somewhere else in the world. So they have a higher risk sort of inherently. So that's sort of the first step in the sort of nested sieve approach to use a weed risk assessment. The second place is to figure out the place. Again, right plant, right place, right time. So the geography is very important. And this is a modeling tool. It's a very simple tool that integrates temperature and precipitation information. And you integrate that with the known locations of the plant, and you can project where geographically is this plant likely to do well. So you see on the bottom left there, we have an output for giant reed. This is a plant that was one of the sort of worst invasive plants in the Southern California region. And you can see that it would do quite well in most of the southeastern United States, whereas if you're in Minnesota and the Dakotas, probably not much of an issue, where blue here is indicating a good habitat. So this is sort of one additional tool to use to figure out geographically where should we focus our efforts. And sort of the next step in the scale, we've gone from very, very large scale down to very fine scale, would be to do field testing. Now this is where you would evaluate where could these plants establish by doing germination tests. You can grow them under different environments. You can identify how quickly they spread, what's their dispersal potential. So you get really high quality information here. However, the reason we don't do this all the time is this is incredibly expensive to do and has to be replicated in all the relevant geographies. So if we were looking to introduce a species in the southeastern United States, if I did an experiment in Virginia, that wouldn't be applicable to all the southeastern United States. It would have to be done in a variety of locations. So again, high quality information, but there's a consequence that it's very costly to do. Okay, so that's all in sort of the cultivar selection piece of this. Sort of the next step in the life cycle is under production. So are there best management practices that could be adopted for each grower that would minimize invasion risk? As most of you know, when you pass by a farmer's field, they plant the corn and soybean basically to the roadside, right? But one of the things we need to take into consideration here is that these plants are perennial and they spread with time. So depending on the biology of the species may dictate how we manage that field. So in this case, you see on the brown area marked here, we're calling a buffer region. So an area that's managed outside the production area to minimize spread potential. And the size of that would be dictated by the biology of the species. For example, if we had a species like giant reed, I'm showing in the bottom right, that's a great picture showing how it regenerates from stems. So basically a stem falls over and they generate from that new stem. As opposed to a plant like Miscanthus that has wind-blown seeds, the size of that buffer may vary. And here's an example of a group at University of Illinois that did a really nice field experiment to evaluate how far could those seeds move. That's really high quality information to integrate into best management practices. And you can see that most of the seeds fall fairly close to where the source, but see some of them can blow close to ½ a kilometer away. So the way you manage these two crops could be very different depending on biology. So there's a series of best management practices that can be put in place at the field scale. And sort of the last piece before we get into the policy and regulation is what happens under some unintended scenarios. So we can't plan for everything, and some things will inevitably go wrong. So what we've got under risky transitions here are some scenarios where either maybe we did not adequately determine the risk of that plant and something that has escaped where we did not anticipate that, or alternatively the plant that's in the conversion facility that contracts with all the growers goes out of business, and now you've got tens of thousands of acres potentially of this plant that you can't sell it to, so now what do you do with it? We also have opportunities that the farmer sells his land. So now you've got a transfer of ownership, and maybe the original farmer was under a contract with that company, but is that transferred to the next landowner? And then lastly, if we've got scenarios where the BMPs that are in place to minimize risk just aren't being followed. So what scenarios, how's that being dealt with? And there's a variety of things to take into consideration, some of which Reed's going to cover, is who's responsible. So if a plant blows a kilometer away, who's responsible for managing that? Do we have an eradication procedure in place? This is something that is, I would argue, highly necessary before we scale up to large acreages, is we need to figure out how to kill it before we grow it. That way we understand how to deal with it sort of after the fact. And then lastly, just sort of regarding escapes or just notification of landholders. So again, that's sort of the sort of nested sieve approach up to the point of choosing cultivars, growing them in place, and then what we do after the fact. And now I'll turn it over to Reed to talk about sort of the policy and regulatory aspects.
Okay, thanks, Jacob. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how our current governmental and non-governmental regulatory and policy systems incorporate or don't incorporate this sort of life cycle approach into current practice. And you can sort of think about our regulatory systems as three different boxes. First is non-governmental certification and guidance. Second is permit programs, and the third is incentive and subsidy programs. First, non-regulatory tools. There's a number of groups out in the world that are working on this from a non-governmental perspective. IUCN has guidance on responsible production of bioenergy that includes invasion, certification, the Roundtable on Sustainable Biomass and Bioproducts, Biomaterials. They've recently changed their name. Thank you, Aviva. Has a certification program for responsible production, again. And both of these two things that I've highlighted here do call for weed risk assessment as part of a responsible grower. They also call for best management practices that include weed risk, a limited number of management measures that are going to happen during the production process. Those are a little bit vague, and they require a lot on the behalf of the grower in terms of knowledge and compliance practices. So it's certainly not a complete solution to this problem. From the government or regulatory process perspective, mostly the default rule is we can plant in the ground whatever plant we feel is appropriate and would like to put in the ground. We don't need a permit to go out and put a miscanthus in our yard. So that's the default rule. There's some exceptions and important groups that we do actually require a permit for. The first step would be import, and in a few countries around the world, Australia and New Zealand are the two critical ones here. Weed risk assessment is used as what I call a decision rule, where the decision on whether import should be allowed is down to the score that the species gets on the weed risk assessment. We don't have that type of rule in this country, although it has been shown to produce net economic benefits in Australia and New Zealand. Instead, we're using weed risk assessment and other cultivar selection technologies as a decision support tool, where our agencies will look to these tools to back up their decisions on whether to regulate a species or a cultivar or not. There's a couple of groups of species in this country that I want to touch on. First is the noxious and invasive plant lists that exist at the federal and at the state levels. And weed risk assessment is now being used importantly as a tool for deciding whether or not a species should be added to that list in most states. There's a number of other strategies that have been used in the past to make that decision as well. It is possible to get a permit to put a noxious weed in the ground. That permit will have very severe and strict management measures associated with it, and this is a fairly rare activity. The second group is genetically modified crops, and I think this is one where it's sort of the closest example we have to this nested sieve approach, where a permit is required. That permit will issue after a NEPA process that includes environmental assessment. It may include weed risk assessment as well. As the process goes from a very brand new type of crop to a crop that's approved for widespread environmental release, there's a process of increasing field tests and permits that have stringent or less stringent management measures depending on the risk that's associated with those. And the final group here that I want to touch on is state laws that address bioenergy crop permits. A few states, Florida, Mississippi, and Idaho, are the three really notable states here, have required a permit to plant any non-native bioenergy crop. And those will often use weed risk assessment as a decision support tool again. There may be, in Florida, for example, a site-specific consideration, so it goes beyond that weed risk assessment as well. But once a permit is issued, that permit will, of course, include management measures to reduce the risk of escape, and those can be very, very specific. And the laws that these states have put in have specific mandatory requirements that each permit must include, and those include things like field buffers that Jake had mentioned. It's also sort of interesting to note that these laws generally have a de minimis exception, where if you're putting in less than 2 acres of a crop, you don't need a permit. So we can enable some of this mechanistic or field testing model without needing to go through the permit. So it's a way to generate the information that we need to make a more informed decision. The third category of government or regulatory approaches here is the incentive and subsidy programs, and there's tons of these, and I'm not going to touch on them for the most part in detail. Just note two, the USDA BCAP program, the Biomass Crop Assistance Program, is notable in part because it limits eligibility to non-invasive crops, and in fact the Illinois clone of miscanthus has been one that has received benefits under this program, where growers receive help in financial help in getting this to market. The Farm Bill also, most recent Farm Bill, specifically approved of the use of weed risk assessment for making decisions on whether a particular crop that's up for this program is eligible, which is, I think, the first time weed risk assessment was put into federal law. And I think that's a pretty interesting and groundbreaking change. If a permit, an area is approved for the BCAP program, that there's of course a stewardship plan that has management measures and things of this nature to further constrain risk. The renewable fuel standard is another one I want to touch on. It gets a lot of play, and I know we have some experts in the room today who will tell us if I'm messing anything up, but hopefully I won't. Under this program, it's run by EPA. Eligible crops can generate renewable energy credits, and eligibility is based on greenhouse gas emission targets for different categories of bioenergy. And high-risk crops recently have been required to obtain a risk mitigation plan before being produced. I think that's something we'll probably hear more about in a little bit, but that's a determination that's made in collaboration between APHIS and EPA that may include things like risk assessment to determine whether an RMP is required, and then to determine what those specific mitigation measures might be. Finally, grant programs such as those issued by DOE and at the state level also may include some of these provisions on selection of different feedstocks that are invasive or non-invasive.
Excuse me? Very quick question, but in the collaboration between USDA, APHIS, and EPA to determine whether or not a risk management plan is needed, which part of EPA is that?
Okay, just to repeat the question for folks online, the question was which part of EPA is working with APHIS on making decisions about risk mitigation plans, and that would be OTAC, the Office of Transportation and Air Quality. I live in Akron and Lynn, so and I'm sure we can get into more in the Q&A about that if folks are interested. My last slide, I'm going to take a little bit of a step back and try to draw some conclusions about the life cycle. So if we think about pre-introduction,
WRA is used internationally as a decision rule, but in this country we're using it mostly to support our decisions rather than as the rule determining what we decide. We're using things like niche modeling and mechanistic modeling as well, and DE plant, again, permitting is maybe the best example of our nested sieve there. Number two, post-introduction management. A lot of our permit programs and our incentive programs will have management measures that are required as a condition of permit, which is an important consideration, and those can be fairly robust. Finally, closure is one that is a little bit trickier from a policy perspective. I didn't mention on the previous slide about state bioenergy permit programs. Those do require financial bonds for growers to assure that money is available to clean up if a company abandons a plot or goes bankrupt. Those can't be used off the acreage that's under cultivation generally, though. So it's a fairly limited tool, and it may not really cover the full extent of an escape if it was to occur. So I think from a policy perspective, closures is a real area where there is some thinking and work to be done. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to Jacob, and thank you all for your attention.
Well, just briefly, I just wanted to reiterate sort of the approach that we took. Again, there's no single solution to this obviously very complex problem. Just highlighting that we went across the life cycle of the biofuel supply chain and used this nested sieve approach, so covering the sort of empirical scientific down to the policy and regulatory tools. So that's sort of the general overview of the CAST papers. So I'll send it back over to Ken.
Thank you. Thank you, Jacob and Reed. We'll have a chance to kind of follow on with some Q&A. We've invited a number of folks to kind of provide comment perspective on the paper, as well as maybe add their thinking around this topic. And the first presenter, very pleased to have with us Edith Glazier with the National Wildlife Federation to share her perspective and maybe some comments on the paper as well. So, Edith.
Thank you, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me to say a few comments about National Wildlife Federation's perspective on this life cycle approach to low invasion bioenergy. So I just wanted to start off by giving a quick overview of National Wildlife Federation's general approach to bioenergy. We are working to ensure that bioenergy and biofuels are done in a sustainable manner, and our vision of sustainable bioenergy is bioenergy that has climate benefits, has economic benefits, doesn't threaten habitat, biodiversity, water, soils, and of course, the one that I'm going to be talking about, and the one that we're talking about today, is the invasive issue. Jacob already told us that invasive species pose a pretty serious risk to ecosystems, definitely to wildlife, native species. A lot of threatened and endangered species got to that point because of invasive species. Once an invasive species becomes a problem, it is often too late for eradication, and that's, again, like that quote from Dan Simberloff that we heard earlier. When we're talking about bioenergy, this is especially important because the idea is to have a large scale of plantings, but the idea is to have this stuff commercialized, and the larger scale of plantings is going to increase the likelihood of escape, even in a low-risk feedstock crop, which is why it's so important to have this life cycle approach. And prevention and precaution really is key, and learning from our history and not repeating the Kudzu effect. So I wanted to just say a few things about signs of progress, because I do think that a lot has changed in this issue, in this area, in the last 5 or so years that I've been working on it. I've seen a lot more awareness about the invasive potential as one of the issues with bioenergy. 5 years ago, I don't think it was on the radar of most people, except for some academics like Jacob. But most of the public, when there were discussions about the environmental concerns about bioenergy. They focused on concerns about water, about greenhouse gases, sometimes about land use, but really not on the invasive issue. Just wasn't on anybody's radar. And we've seen a lot more awareness. It's now part of discussions. We've seen stakeholders being involved in this, decision makers, also it's on their radar. We're seeing a lot of companies trying to be proactive on this and really trying to avoid invasion issues up front before they start. It's in their best interest. These are companies that are trying to do the right thing. They're companies that are trying to find new sources of clean, renewable energy. And they certainly don't want to start the next big invasion. We're also seeing an increasing number of policies addressing the issue. Reed went through them, so I won't go through them again, but a lot of these are new in the last few years. And I think it's pretty significant, at least from the environmental world, trying to actually being able to see these kind of areas of progress in a short amount of time. I think that's pretty big deal. Of course, there's still a lot to be done, and current regulation at this point is just not adequate to deal with this problem and to adequately prevent potential invasions. We do have an executive order on the books that prohibits agencies from pursuing the cultivation or incentivizing the cultivation of potentially invasive species without doing a full risk analysis. That often, that's a good start, but it's not mandated by law. We're also, federal agencies have to deal with competing mandates. A lot of agencies, they have a statute in place that they're trying to fulfill. Their job is to assess a feedstock and approve a feedstock based on X, Y, and Z criteria, and the invasive part of it just isn't there. And furthermore, they don't have the right resources to do it. We rely pretty heavily on the weed risk assessment portion and on USDA APHIS for their ability to help us figure out what is and help policymakers figure out what's invasive, what's not. And I'm sure they are not as adequately funded as would be necessary to really be able to cover this issue. We heard about noxious weed lists. Those are just not at all sufficient at the federal or state level. They're not meant to deal with this kind of emerging issue. And what we're left with then is a lot of piecemeal policies, a lot of good things here and there, but we don't currently have any comprehensive policies that address the full life cycle, that full nested sieve approach. I think that there are ways to apply this approach to policy, and what we really need is a consistent policy across all federal mandates, applying to all incentive programs, procurement programs, loans, research funding, dealing with incentivizing bioenergy crops. The first thing for us is that high-risk feedstocks should be rejected. That's the first thing, cultivar selection, and for us, we think that the risks are so great and the precaution is so important that the high-risk feedstocks should be rejected. The low-risk, non-native, or carefully chosen native species, those should be approved or incentivized. And then those feedstocks that have a score that they come out of the weed risk assessment with of evaluate further, those should be grown on a pilot basis so more research can be done to figure out what the invasive potential is. Again, risk mitigation measures should be used for all bioenergy feedstocks, appropriate to the feedstocks, and policies should address all aspects of the life cycle, including closure, which Reed talked about how important that is and how, I think actually Reed and Jacob talked about how important that is and how difficult it can be. If a company ends up going belly up, what happens to the fields, what happens to the escapes, who's responsible for that? So there's a lot of challenges that remain that make this a pretty difficult issue. Assessing various cultivars is really important. We saw the example of miscanthus and the Illinois clone versus seeded miscanthus. It's the same species cultivar. Completely different scores of weed risk assessment. One is far more invasive than the other. Trying to actually assess all of the different cultivars, though, is a very big challenge, especially when there's a lot of research, there's a lot of innovation happening. Selective breeding as well can impact invasion potential over time. That's a gradual process. At what point do you have to reassess that feedstock? Things like algae, aquatic microfauna, a lot of interest in making biofuel from them, and those are more difficult to assess than plants. There's also emerging interest in synthetic biology for biofuels, creating novel species. Again, this is a new issue. We don't know how to deal with it. And then there's also non-biofuel end uses. This stuff there's not just interest in growing it for biofuel, there's interest in growing it for a lot of different things. The bioproduct market is really growing. If a company wants to grow a bioenergy crop, they're going to do test plots as well. Those test plots aren't what they harvest from those plots. That's not biofuel it's not considered an energy crop until they actually make biofuel out of it. So there can be years where these very invasive or potentially invasive plants are growing where none of the bioenergy policies or permitting applies to them because they're not technically bioenergy plants yet. So there's really a challenge remaining of how to balance incentivizing this exciting, innovative, renewable energy source with the need for regulation and precaution. And with that, I'll turn it over to our colleagues from USDA.
Thank you. Yeah. Also pleased to have with us to help provide their thoughts and perspective a couple of gentlemen from USDA APHIS. We have with us Dr. Tony Coop and Mr. Jonathan Jones, and they're going to talk both about the science and the regulatory side, the policy side of this. So thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Hi, my name is Tony Coop, and I'm with USDA APHIS PPQ, and I'm here today with Jonathan Jones, and we're going to talk to you about some of the risk assessment and regulatory aspects of this life cycle approach. First of all, I think the authors hit it spot on when they talked about a life cycle approach. In the risk assessment world, most people would probably call this a pathway approach, but the idea is the same. Basically, we want to describe all the ways that bioenergy species can escape and spread along the entire life cycle or bioenergy production pathway, and identify ways to mitigate that risk if that risk is too great. Jacob Barney and his colleagues talked about that the process starts from crop selection, planting method, crop development, harvest, transportation, biofuel processing, and field closure. So these are all opportunities or points along the pathway by which a species could escape and become invasive. Now, one of the things that we haven't really stressed enough about is the potential risk associated with crop breeding and improvement. Humanity has had a huge impact on the species we cultivate. Just look at corn, wheat, and citrus. These species are very different and no longer occur in natural wild populations. More recent examples include knockout roses and encore azaleas. Breeders are always trying to improve the crops for some specific end purpose. And because of this breeding, we probably need to be assessing risk for different cultivars as they are developed. Here are some examples of traits that could be improved with respect to bioenergy crops. Growth rate, fiber content, tillering ability, etc., etc. Now, some of these traits can make a species less invasive. Some of them may make it more invasive, and some of them may have no impact at all. It's unlikely that a change in any one trait is going to turn a non-invader into a major invader overnight. But there are other aspects of breeding, certain types of breeding, that might have that impact. Hybridization or polyploidization, that's where you increase the basic chromosomal count of a species. These types of breeding could have an impact on big impact on the invasive ability of a species. Now, the authors in their life cycle approach talk about the importance of doing a tiered risk assessment. And I agree, this is also
very important when we're talking about planting species at massive landscape scales, right? And this is particularly important if the risk is borderline or the uncertainty associated with the assessments is high. At the same time, the authors also spoke about grower best management practices, risk mitigation plans, closure plans, bonds, etc. All of these are tools that to help us reduce the risk and increase the benefit of bioenergy production. Now, one of the things I know we're thinking about this, but I haven't really seen it on paper or the importance of this stressed yet. And I think we need some type of a framework for bioenergy risk analysis. Now, what am I talking about? Risk analysis is the combination of risk assessment and risk management in an iterative process. Risk assessment is the evaluation of the likelihood and the consequences of an adverse event. Risk management, on the other hand, is the identification, selection, and evaluation of risk mitigation tools, best management practices, things that reduce risk. So let's look at this a little bit further. In these two boxes here, we've got our tiered risk assessment approach that Jacob Barney and his colleagues talked about. We start with the baseline risk assessment of the species. We then look at site-specific information, climate niche modeling, local population dynamics, and other practices. Okay? If the risk is low, then we can proceed directly to decision-making. No need for risk mitigation protocols. But if there is some risk and we're interested in proceeding with cultivating the species, then we need to proceed to risk management, where we first identify mitigation options that can help reduce the risk along each of those points in the pathway we just talked about. We then need to reevaluate the risk of the species to see if those risk mitigation options are actually reducing the risk. If they are, we can proceed to decision making. If we find that they're not sufficient, then we can go back, change those options, strengthen them, and reevaluate risks to make sure that they do reduce the risk to an acceptable level. So here again, we've got that iterative process between risk assessment and risk management, right? Now, let's say that a species is approved, is planted, there are options in place. Well, we probably, particularly if we have high uncertainty associated with the mitigation options themselves, are they really going to work, are they not? We probably need to be monitoring and conducting surveillance in these fields to make sure these species, that the mitigation options are working to reduce the risk of these species from escaping. If they're not, well, guess what? We go back, we change the measures, we strengthen them to the point where risk is now acceptable. Now, this is another key component of this framework, is that there is an acceptable level of risk. That is, we can never completely eliminate risk, but theoretically there is some value where it is acceptable to us, and we need to come to that understanding as a society. Other people think about this from the opposite side of the coin, which is an acceptable level of protection, but it's basically the same idea. Jonathan.
Thank you. Jonathan Jones, good afternoon. I'm going to comment on the regulatory aspects of this paper. APHIS does not regulate bioenergy production per se, as Aviva noted. We did become involved with biofuel production 2.5 years ago after stakeholders expressed concern about the potential invasiveness of arundo giant cane and Napier grass pennisetum in response to the EPA renewable fuel standard. Since July 2013, we have had involvement when EPA published their rule for arundo and pennisetum to evaluate risk management plans for those seeking permits from EPA for these species. EPA also has consulted with the USDA about invasive potential of other species they are evaluating for biofuel production under their renewable fuel standard. We do regulate certain plants as noxious weeds and have since 1976. We do this in 3 ways. First is federal noxious weeds, which are prohibited from entering the U.S. and moving interstate commerce. Second is NAPRA, N-A-P-P-R-A, that's not allowed pending pest risk analysis species. Yeah, it's a mouthful, right? which are plant species which are not authorized for propagation into the U.S. until they can be fully evaluated using a risk assessment. Finally, we regulate a few crop seeds as seed contaminants in agriculture and vegetable seed. We do use WRAs, weed risk assessments, to inform regulatory decisions about these species. One of the points made in the paper in an earlier presentation was that APHIS could regulate these potential bioenergy crops before they are imported into the country. The challenge here, though, is that many of these are widely cultivated in the country already, and many are also naturalized. So the door's been open, and they're already in. However, if the potential bioenergy species meets the requirements of either the Federal National Weed Program or NAPRA, then we are in a position to do something about it. Finally, I'll add that APHIS's Biotechnology and Regulatory Services regulates genetically engineered species. If a potential bioenergy species is genetically engineered, it may be subject to regulation under their authority. Any questions now, Kevin, or how do you want to do this? Someone has a hand up, which is why I asked.
Okay. Well, thank you. And thank you to all of our presenters, and we give them a round of applause. I'd like to invite all of you up forward to the front, and we have a few minutes to answer some questions. So all of the presenters, both Jacob, Reed, Viva, Tony, and Jonathan, will open up to questions. We do have, I think, I was cued that we actually have a couple of questions that have come to us through the webinar process online. So I think we will kind of start. Colin, would you like to maybe share the first question coming in off the webinar, and then we'll go to a live question here in the room.
Okay. Do either USDA or US EPA consult on the evaluation / approving new biofuel crop plants with US FWS?
The USDA does not work directly with Fish and Wildlife Service on EPA's the species under consideration for EPA, and I do not know what EPA does in regards to that. But we have someone who might want to comment.
Yeah.
Sharon Lay with Environmental Protection Agency. We do not consult with Fish and Wildlife Service, just with USDA.
Is there a question maybe here in the from the live audience? Yeah.
Thank you. A question for the APHIS gentleman. The authority that you use to regulate genetically engineered crops is based upon their potential to become a plant pest. It seems to me that that would also give you adequate authority to regulate potentially invasive bioenergy crops if you chose to do so.
So you're talking more of a pest plant, perhaps, rather than a plant pest. And we probably have the authority under the Plant Protection Act, but we do not have the regulatory framework to do that this time.
So you don't need anything more from Congress. You would just need to do rulemaking to establish the framework.
That's correct.
Okay.
I think it's important to note that I believe that BRS has an open comment period thinking about changes to their genetically engineered crop regulatory structure. So that might be something that comes up during that process. And obviously we don't have BRS here, so with an open comment period, they wouldn't have much to say anyway.
Colin, another question from our webinar participants.
Okay. Why is there an acceptable level of risk for potentially invasive biofuel plants, but not for candidate weed biological control agents?
We don't have anyone here from our biocontrol part of the agency, so that one I'm not ready to address.
Yeah, I mean, the only other thing I could say about that is in any kind of program, there's always there's always some level of risk. You can never completely mitigate the risk. And perhaps, we need to do more work at education to help people understand that there's always some level of risk. The question is, are we reducing that risk to a low enough level that it's like maybe a 1 in 1,000-year flood or 1 in 500-year flood? What is it that we are reducing the risk to?
Question.
Hi, my name is Claire Thorpe. I'm the Managing Director of the Biotechnology Innovation Organisation's Industrial and Environmental Section. So our members are those companies that use biotechnology to produce biofuels or renewable chemicals. And we're regulated by the EPA under TSCA for the renewable chemicals, but so too are the genetically engineered microorganisms. By contrast, the crops are regulated through USDA. As you can tell, I'm not from the United States, I'm from Ireland, and I spent a lot of time working on policy. I used to work for the Irish government, and one of the documents that I love that was written in the United States comes from 1992, and it's the part of the update to the Coordinated Framework for Biotechnology, and it's the principles on which you regulate around risk. And one of the principles that appealed to me and which I thought was very intelligent was the fact that there is also a risk to over-regulating as well as under-regulating. And as regulators, and I've been one myself, you always tend to focus on all the bad stuff that can happen, and you tend to look at the worst-case scenario. But when I'm now wearing an industry hat, I see a lot of the members of the companies that we have, which range in size from a small emerging company with 4 people all the way up to massive behemoths. We're looking at an industry which is struggling to gain the investment and that it needs to actually grow and really make the contributions it can to environmental benefits. So I suppose my question is, now we've got such a wonderful array of people in front of us, are you going to, as you move ahead and considering noxious weeds, are you going to also look at the risks of over-regulation and how industry might need to be able to access, on the one hand, a crop which is affordable, reliable, can be produced in sufficient quantities, and yet meet, as was highlighted by the National Wildlife Foundation person, has to meet an awful lot of contradictory requirements around not being this or this or this or this or this. Are we going to have a broader discussion about how we look at it, not just from the risk perspective, but also from what is practical, realistic, and the risk of over-regulation?
I think, speaking for APHIS, I think you've touched on something that may not be widely known or visible, is that we are always looking for non-regulatory solutions. We are not looking to quickly step into putting up a new program, to expand our regulations, to enhance our regulations, especially if we can work with industry to find a way forward that addresses the problem, addresses the concern, and addresses our concerns and works with industry. So I hadn't remembered that or hadn't thought of that 1992 statement in a long time, but it is something we're trying, I think, more and more to embrace and keep in mind as we go forward.
I, for one, applaud you for that. I wish there were some other regulators in this town that had a similar philosophy.
Well, thank you.
Other questions? Yes.
How are we going to deal with that? Which are currently regulated as a microorganism by the EPA and are now being increasingly produced in open ponds and not contained systems. I mean, again, this is one of the gaps. I'm wondering if there is any, when you consider the ability to spread or invade, has anybody started looking at algae either in the academic sphere or even how you define the flipping things, because sometimes it can be seaweed and sometimes it can be pond scum.
Then we'll leave that to who would like to respond. Does anybody?
Well, we've actually listed one as a federal noxious weed. So you recall what the
Callirpa.
Callirpa?
Yeah.
So we did venture there, and there was a lot of discussion. Do we really want to go into the ocean and regulating those? But my wife, Meredith, this morning asked me, she said, well, they can use algae as a biofuel. How are you going to do that? And that's going, hadn't given that a lot of thought. So it's a good question. Perhaps EPA has, but it's not something that is that we've given a lot of thought to in APHIS at this point.
Brilliant.
I'll just add to that. I think for a long time, personally, algae's been the next thing that I wanted to look at. It's sort of in a different box, as you say, from a traditional row crop. I will note that one state, Florida, has sort of gone there with their state bioenergy law. They do regulate algal production, and I think it's enclosed. I don't remember exactly, so I won't venture too far down that road. But that is an effort that's going on. And I think there is a difference, like you mentioned, between open pond and biorefinery or enclosed zero discharge kind of environments for that in terms of the risk profile. But it's certainly something that if you got the wrong critter, that could be a problem for water quality, and that puts you in a whole different regulatory world with potentially Clean Water Act coming into play, as well as some of these other laws and regulations. The other thing is synthetic biology. I think Aviva mentioned is a really interesting and interesting development for algae. And I think just last week, we had a webinar on gene drives, and synthetic biology is a big part of that. So technology is not going anywhere in this space, and there's definitely work to be done.
I think the irony is a lot of the synthetic biology technologies can actually render the organism less likely to invade and actually from the exposure perspective be safer, but that also automatically ensures that they will be regulated relative to their wild counterpart.
Well, in talking to BRS in the past, one thing that they always point out, and I think it's actually totally true, is biotechnology is neither inherently good nor bad in terms of invasion risk or other characteristics. It's all in what you're selecting for.
Yeah.
And I think I can't speak for you as an industry, but it seems to me like that's a pretty insightful and useful potential partner for you in trying to manage these things. And certainly from the environmental perspective, many groups would support a modification to reduce risks in that way.
Okay, so you want to add something to it?
Yeah, I mean, regarding whether people are looking at this, I've been in this sphere for a decade now, and I've never met anyone people ask me that all the time, well, are you looking at it for algae? I've never met anyone in a decade that's actually doing that research. Some of what we've outlined today is applicable to that, but the macrophyte people also don't necessarily hang out with the microphyte people, and so there's bins around everybody's field, and so it's a highly relevant question, but one that I don't think we've even scratched the surface of.
Another question here. Yes.
Hi, Ryan Matthews with the Human Project. I'm wondering, in terms of risk management of bioenergy, is there any dialogues around implementation in urban areas? I know you talked about the right space for these crops to grow, and using all new land. So there's urban areas the dialogue in that as well. And part two of this question is the ag education. Is there any communication between these organizations in front of us and ag universities with implementation in local communities?
Open it up to anybody that would like to respond.
I'm maybe not the right person. I don't know of anybody talking about urban spaces. I mean, I've heard projects proposed along rights of way, along roadsides and power lines, and there's all kinds of other issues with that. You can't have a 25-foot tall grass growing on a median strip for safety reasons. But that was one area brought up. Well, there's millions of acres of unused space along our roadsides, which seems like a low-hanging fruit, but it has these safety considerations. That's the closest I've heard to that.
Yeah, I haven't heard of any urban projects. I would think if there are any, they would be more of the algae type projects because they take a lot less land. And again, that gets into the issues we were just talking about.
As far as extension, I think that was the other part of the question. I would just note that BCAT, for one program, is managed at the Farm Service Agency county level. And that may be true for some of the other grant and subsidy and incentive programs that are being carried out, particularly at the state level, and maybe even at the local level, although I don't know how much of that is going on.
Thank you.
Well, I know universities have, extension programs, and where there are projects in place, I know that they are out in the community talking about this. I mean, I've written an extension document on this topic in particular, but I think that would primarily be fed through the university extensions.
Yeah, and I will say, I've seen one of the authors they attend University of Tennessee. I graduated from there. I graduated from University of Tennessee in agriculture, and I'm aware of the bioenergy work they're doing. And my question stems from that. The extension programs, they're doing great work, and but it's like the information has been housed there and not easily assimilated out to communities. I'll take that back. In rural areas, yes, but I don't see it much in urban areas where a lot of population is heading towards.
Yeah.
So I do agree. Yeah.
Another comment or question in the back?
Oh, I just wanted to comment that
Bring the microphone up.
I just want to comment. My name is Finn Hunt with the National Institute of Food and Agriculture. As Jacob, they mentioned that in terms of the education, mostly are carried out by the university, not only the extension level, but also from the research perspective, educate the future workforce in about fuel bioenergy area.
Colin, do you have any more questions online?
Yes. If an invasive plant is already present in the area under consideration, how does this status factor into biofuel crop selection?
Is that a regulatory question? Or
Yeah,
a moral
I don't-
question?
I think it's more of a business question. I would think for the producer is how they're going to deal with site selection and site preparation. Doesn't really enter into the regulatory process. I don't think either EPA nor ours that I can think of.
So I have heard that when there's a wild type variety that is in nearby field or a related cultivar that's near a planting, there's often eradication efforts to make sure there's not any crossbreeding and doesn't help spread. And I've heard that with miscanthus, I believe, and that's under BCAP, but I'm not sure that's exactly the question.
But I think outside, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but outside of the regulated noxious weeds that are at the federal and state level, lots of states and other organizations maintain invasive plant lists, which are non-regulated lists. They're sort of more for public education, etc. If you're on that list, I think you're free to plant it, to my knowledge, because it's not a regulated species. So while it may seem illogical to do so, you're not prevented from doing it. That's my understanding.
Other questions? Well, thank you to our panelists. Thank you to all of you for your time. Particularly thank you to Jacob and Reed and the contributions of your writing team toward the accomplishment of this paper. I would like to just in closing thank all of you also online for your time and tuning in, thanking as well as our live participants. I'd like to particularly thank ELI for hosting today. This was a great venue, and particularly the ability to access the technology that allows many people to view this online. It's something that we've really never done at CAST, that we're very interested in seeing how we can utilize this technology to reach a broader audience when we do these publications. I would remind everybody, if you would like more information about this paper in particular or other publications at CAST, what I would direct you to our website, www.castscience.org. You can download the publication. You can also download the one-page quick cast. There are ample copies of it here as well if you'd like to take any of those with you. So again, thanks everybody, and hopefully you'll be able to attend the next release of a CAST paper coming up very soon. Thank you.
Thank you.